Hello, welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 203, and I'm the show's host, Kyle. On this show, I'm going to be updating Afghanistan and Israel from the past couple of weeks. It's been well over a week since I really talked about what's going on in either of these conflicts, and so I want to catch that up. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com and libertarianinstitute.org. And sharing the show is making a difference. I mean, thank you all so much, but the show continues to grow week after week. The show is either having its best week or, very close within that range. And then within the next week, again, setting the best week pace. So, we are really gaining steam here, and I hope to have on more guests, do some more in-depth stuff. Because there's some of these conflicts that I find it harder to talk about just because I don't have that full depth of knowledge, and having somebody on, may help to give us, more details and more insight into the situation. So, this is a little bit of a call to my listeners. If you guys would like to recommend guests for the show, specifically thinking of the South China Sea dispute and having somebody explain that, Venezuela and Latin America in general, although I do have a guest in mind who I'm hoping to have on the show for that. And then some of the African conflicts, especially West Africa, what's going on in South Africa and within Kenya, where I see a lot of interesting developments. And the last one I could think of is, of course, the Rohingya crisis there in Myanmar and Bangladesh, where you continue to have somewhat conflicting stories, but interesting updates altogether. So lots of wars to talk about. The American empire pretty much spans the entire globe at this point, so all of it is definitely worth discussing on this show. But, just like all of you, I'm still learning and still trying to piece things together. And as the news comes in, all I'm doing is what I could do and, trying to give a cohesive picture of, what's going on in all these wars. So in Afghanistan, of course, we're, approaching, the 17th anniversary of this war, and continues to be a disaster. We have casualties up 42% in May over April. And not to sound pessimistic, but this was somewhat expected as the spring offensive, I believe, began right in the beginning of May this year. And of course, that's the start of the fighting season for the Taliban in Afghanistan. And while there was definitely a lot of fighting going on through the winter, it really didn't stop in past years. It, I guess, had almost stopped. But, we continue to have the U.S. wage a drug war on the Afghan opium trade, especially in the Taliban-controlled areas, killing a lot of civilians in that, as well as the Taliban carrying out a number of suicide bombings, and a lot of those being in Kabul. And you also have the additional element of the Islamic State Khorasan affiliate, whose stronghold is the Nangarhar province of Afghanistan and controls, I believe, the old Al-Qaeda stomping grounds at Tora Bora. And they have been responsible for a lot of these suicide bombings in Afghanistan. Another critical event in Afghanistan is that we have an upcoming election in the fall. We've already seen that the militant groups, the Taliban and the Islamic State K, have targeted these voting facilities, either kidnapping the voter registration employees, just simply carrying out suicide attacks outside the door, directly killing the employees of these agencies, and then the police force members working there. And so I think if you're going to try to have a legitimate election in Afghanistan, that means you need the participants of the Pashtuns. And if you need to register those people to vote, then you're going to have voter facilities in heavily Pashtun and Taliban controlled areas. And this is going to create a real danger for, continued suicide bombing through the fighting months coming up here. And we also see, the voter registration facilities being hit in big cities like Kabul. But generally, it does seem like a lot of, pretty much everything is a target these days. It's not like there's a whole lot of discrimination as far as the killing goes, especially it seems from ISIS-K, who I guess carried out a targeted assassination of a deputy governor of a province at a cricket match. And I mean, the Taliban responded pretty quickly to say this wasn't us, and I don't know, maybe the Taliban do feel like there's some rules or codes still exist between them and the Afghan government and the Afghan army, where they have agreements not to attack certain sites, but it doesn't seem like ISIS plays by these rules. We also had some pretty brazen attacks by the Taliban. Of course, I talked about on this show the Taliban operation to take and briefly seize Fara City before withdrawing. again, I haven't been able to figure out how much or if any weapons the Taliban was able to smuggle out, and if there was a purpose to the Taliban taking that city other than just to prove they can, if there was some kind of tactical edge there or whatever. But in a lot of these areas, especially in the heavily populated Pashtun and tribal areas of Afghanistan, the Taliban reigns supreme, especially in the rural areas. And the U.S. is definitely no closer to winning this war by whatever standards you could possibly imagine today than they were when Trump took office or Trump announced his plan last August. Another brazen attack by the Taliban, they attacked the Interior Ministry. I guess they attempted to use U.S. Army soldiers, uniforms, to infiltrate the facility. However, they used outdated or older uniform, and the security guards recognized this. One person did die in the attack other than the militant attackers. I'm not quite sure who carried out this attack. In the articles I have read, just labeled them as militants. We have a study out saying that 44% of Afghan children are not attending school, and that 60% of these children are girls. Now, I don't want to say that left to their own devices and had the United States never overthrown the Taliban government of Afghanistan in 2001, that the enrollment in schooling would be higher. However, I think one of the goals of the Afghan war has been, from the American standpoint at least, is to build a nation there, and building a nation in a Western image. And that includes all young children attending school just like they do in the US, the UK, Switzerland, etc. And so I think it is a failure, and it shows failure of the U.S. war in Afghanistan that so few Afghan children attend school. Now, you have to assume that at least part of this is contributed to war, because schools do get blown up, because you do read stories about children who are attending school and either step on an artillery shell that didn't explode, or a mine, or their school is attacked by a suicide bomber, or I can't remember what was the last time I read about U.S. airstrike hitting school in Afghanistan, but these kind of things do happen in wars. I did read a story put out by the Taliban, and I'm not sure if this is going to reflect a change in strategy or not, but they do say that they are now targeting NATO and U.S. troops, and not necessarily the Afghan army troops that are fighting against them. So I haven't seen any stories since this time to suggest that U.S. and NATO troops are dying at a higher rate, or the Taliban are carrying out more attacks against those troops, but that's what the Taliban are saying. They are targeting some Afghani people who honored Trump. I guess these two guys made some kind of Trump medal. I'm not sure why. I don't understand the purpose of it, and maybe it means a lot more to the Afghani people for cultural reasons. And, before you belittle the Afghani people in your minds for caring about, who makes a medal honoring who, think about the debate in the United States over the NFL players kneeling during the national anthem or not. It's stupid cultural traditions that cause people to get outraged and hate each other. But, this is going on in Afghanistan. Those people are being targeted. And I'm not quite sure, how much propaganda this story is versus how much truth is to it, just because this would be a good way for the Taliban to be demonized in the eyes of the West. I certainly don't want to overlook that when I talk about these kind of stories, but they're also targeting the Afghani father who named his child after Donald Trump. Now, the same story, which I'll link to in the show notes page, goes on to say that the Afghani people are feeling left down by Donald Trump. And that's, of course, because his policy is just a continuation of Obama and Bush's failed policy of continuing to wage a war and counterinsurgency in Afghanistan that's absolutely never gonna work. Couple more quick stories. Apparently, the Afghan army liberated 2 jails from Taliban controlled and freed the prisoners. It didn't say who these prisoners were, but this is something that I talked about when the U.S. was bombing prisons in Syria that were ISIS prisons, and that is, there's a lot of people in Taliban prisons who are there for crimes that we certainly wouldn't consider crimes, definitely not imprisonable crimes. The Taliban have ordered the opium processing facilities out of the cities and into more, mountainous and rural areas. Now, of course, they say this is for the protection of the civilians. Maybe it is, because like I said, this is an insurgency. And so, the people in the cities are probably the friends, relatives, and families of the leaders and the fighters, the Taliban, right? But at the same time, it may be for strategic purposes, but in order to demonize the U.S., the Afghan army, and to make themselves look like saviors and saints, they could say, we're doing it for you. Like, the U.S. government does this kind of stuff all the time. All right, last story about Afghanistan. The United States Inspector General for the Afghan War said that the $5 billion stabilization plan in Afghanistan has failed. And so you could add this $5 billion to an unbelievably long list of wasted money and failed projects that have gone on during the Afghan war. I mean, I'm sure if we really wanted to make the country a better place, it may have been just better to, fly our planes over Afghanistan and just drop $100 bills on the country rather than dropping the bombs on the country that we have. But, it seems obvious at this point that the solution isn't for the United States government to throw more money or to throw more men at the Afghan war. That isn't going to solve the problem. Israel stuff. 2 flotillas. I think one I talked about on the show in the past, but it launched from one of the Scandinavian countries. It's headed around Europe, around the Spanish peninsula there. And then it's going to make a couple stops in Italy and then, head over to Gaza to, hopefully bypass the Israeli blockade of Gaza and deliver the people there, some goods that the Israeli government doesn't allow them to have, but they're in desperate needs, like medicine, wheelchairs, concrete, stuff like that. I'm not sure what kind of objects are on this particular flotilla. I typically refer back to one where they were just trying to bring in wheelchairs because so many of the Gazan people have been handicapped by the Israeli fighters, and Israel boarded and killed some of the members of that crew. The other flotilla was trying to leave Gaza rather than go to it, and there were, I believe, about 17 wounded students who were trying to get to Crete from Gaza in order to receive some medical treatment for their injuries. I'm not sure how life-threatening these injuries were, but, they needed surgeries possibly to save their legs or something like that. So I just don't want to be too dramatic, and I always try to portray this in the most even-handed way possible just because some people are so quick to just say you're anti-Semitic on this issue. But that flotilla was turned around by the Israeli Navy, I suppose, or whoever the Israelis have enforcing that blockade. They brought them to a prison in Israel, processed them, and then stuck them back in Gaza. Now, it does appear that the Red Cross is sending a team of 50 surgeons to Gaza. I haven't heard of them being stopped, so hopefully that means they're there to perform thousands of surgeries on the people of Gaza who are in desperate need of them because of the massive amount of wounds that these people have taken during protests from fire from Israeli soldiers. So let's remember that starting towards the end of, or I guess sometime in March, I can't remember exactly when, I believe the end of March, the Gazans started to protest every Friday, and then they also protested on Nakba Day, Catastrophe Day, or May 14th, which was the day that the U.S. Embassy was opened in Jerusalem, and have continued to at least hold some protests on the Friday since. In those protests, thousands of Palestinians, Gazan protesters have been injured by live fire bullets, not just by rubber-coated metal bullets, although there's thousands of those injuries as well, and thousands of people injured by the tear gas the Israeli military uses. In fact, this tear gas actually suffocated and killed an 8-month-year-old, very recently. And then there's been well over 100 people killed in these protests. But the Israeli Supreme Court ruled it was lawful for the IDF to continue to use deadly force against these protesters. This is, I guess, very disappointing. You would hope that there would be some aspect of the Israeli government that would be really willing to say, like, oh, this is definitely wrong, and no Israeli soldier has even been injured in these protests, so we really can't say that these are clashes or anything like that. And since the other side is only throwing rots and some fire bombs on kites, maybe there's really no reason that we could say that all these innocent people deserve to be shot, because as we've seen, a lot of the people who are shot are not even people throwing rocks, including a 21-year-old medic. This woman was at the protest in Gaza last Friday, attempting to, I guess, go and tend to somebody who was injured, and was shot in the back of the torso by an Israeli sniper, and she died. And so, I mean, this should be a clear-cut case of murder. A woman was trying to rescue somebody and was shot in the back by a sniper. This is the clearest kind of war crime, but it seems nothing will be done about it. The Israelis say they're going to carry out an investigation, but it's very unlikely that they turn out and say, oh wow, one of our soldiers did murder this woman. Now this has occurred before the killing of that woman, but at the UN, there was 2 resolutions proposed in the Security Council. One was a Kuwaiti resolution that condemned the Israeli violence against the Palestinians in these right of return marches. And this actually gained 10 votes in favor of it. I think there were a few abstentions, and the Americans then vetoed that resolution, preventing it to get through. The Americans proposed their own resolution that condemned Hamas for the deaths of the Palestinians and not the Israelis whatsoever. And this only got the support of the United States. And then a lot of our, more friendly nations abstained from the vote. And so had this happened, let's say in Syria, related to the Duma situation, the U.S. media and Nikki Haley at the UN would be crying and whining about how the Russians are protecting the evil Assad government from facing up to their actions at the UN, but this is exactly what the United States is doing by protecting Israel with our vetoes. And not that, I'm a big fan of the UN or believe that the UN could have strong teeth on matters, but Israel's founding was largely based on a UN resolution. And so, there is some power there, and, good things could happen in that direction if member states at the UN and the US would get out of the way and stop protecting war criminals like we also do with Saudi Arabia and Yemen. There's also been some trading of attacks between Hamas launching rockets into Israel, and I think pretty indiscriminately so. Now, most of these rockets have been intercepted. I think very few have landed, and I'm not aware of any casualties reported from these rocket attacks. The Israeli government has responded by bombing what they call Hamas targets in Gaza and killing, I believe, a few people, at least 2. At least as far as I could tell, the order of attacks in this situation was the Hamas rocket fire first and then the Israeli attacks later. However, I think I agree with, the people who will argue that the people of Gaza, are being violently acted upon by the Israeli government all the time. And, it's not necessarily an act of aggression for them to try to get out. Although you obviously have to condemn Hamas attacking any civilian targets because, Israeli civilians aren't guilty of the crimes of their government. Let's move on to Syria. Israel carried out a bombing in Syria of an airbase about 2 weeks ago. I think it said it was Hezbollah, but I haven't seen any reports of Israel bombing in Syria since. I also read a story that Israel is pushing the United States to recognize the Golan Heights, which is territory that Israel captured and has since occupied from Syria after the 67 war. I mean, in a lot of ways, I think it would be hard to argue that from a facts on the ground situation that this isn't really Israeli territory at this point. They've occupied it for so long. However, I think the Syrian government will continue to contest that claim. On another great episode of Around the Empire that I'll link to in the show notes page, Joanne Leone asked Elijah Magnier about if Assad would be willing to trade away the Golan Heights in exchange for maybe Israel's ending support for the militants near the Israel-Syria-Jordan border, and also, to stop carrying out airstrikes in Syria. And Magnier said that absolutely wouldn't be an option. I had a similar thought, so I thought it was a very good question, and I'll link to that episode in the show notes page. Now, there have been some talks going on between several parties in Syria. The U.S. and Turkey are carrying on their own talks about Manbij, while I believe Jordan, Israel, and Russia were carrying out some talks about the southern border area there. Now, it seems like they're trying to push forward an agreement where it would only be Syrian army troops that recapture that territory near the Israel-Jordan border. And of course, these troops include Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, and ISIS in this region. So it's important to liberate the area from the terrorist groups. However, the Israelis have been protesting that there's going to be Iranian troops involved. Now, my guess is that no matter if there's Iranian troops involved or not, the Israeli government is definitely going to claim there are. As far as it goes in Manbij, I read this morning that U.S. and Turkey agreed to some kind of deal. However, I've read this story several times in the past, and it doesn't seem like the situation has been resolved yet. So this is definitely one that we'll have to wait and see on. And I'm not necessarily going to believe that the Kurds are going to leave Manbij unless I see pictures and video of their troops leaving. I read a story that I thought was pretty interesting. That is the anti-ISIS coalition, that is the U.S. coalition to fight ISIS, deliberately target Canadian troops, or Canadian citizens, who are fighting for ISIS. And so I think these details are going to come out as, the war wraps up, and maybe some of these documents are either declassified or people read them and start to leak them out. But I think, there was a huge problem for all these Western nations that there were a lot of people who had their passports who went to Iraq and Syria and ended up, radical jihadist fighters. And so this created an opportunity for some of these people, I guess, to get back into the country. And it seemed like the solution was more or less to kill them rather than to try to bring them back and hold a trial. And I think to some of these countries, where the U.S., I don't know if this will be a big deal because there's still a large portion of the population that's okay with the death penalty. And of course, we carry out targeted assassinations of people all the time, including U.S. citizen Anwar al-Awlaki, who was a member of AQAP, however, was not actively involved in, trying to carry out attack against the United States at the time that Barack Obama ordered him dead. But a prerequisite to membership for, being in the EU is that you don't have the death penalty in your country. And so that, this certainly seems like a death penalty kind of situation, and even worse without a, judge or jury. So it could just be an interesting angle to see and read about as, like I said, these documents and stories come out. All right, that's all I'll wrap up the show today, everyone. I hope I didn't ramble too much. I felt like I was all over the place. Anyways, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com to share the show, libertarianinstitute.org, iTunes, Stitcher. Give me a rating and review there. Subscribe to the show. That way you never miss one. YouTube and BitChute. The channel name is Immersion News. And of course, immersionnews.com is my news website that I'm putting a lot of time and effort into. And I think it's really coming along. There's a lot of great stuff on there. And of course, I also put out a daily news roundup that could be found at libertarianinstitute.org. And for those of you who are, my patrons for the show, I do appreciate it. I've actually added a number of patrons, and I've offset the show's hosting fees. So that's really awesome. My plan is to, use that money to either buy books to educate myself or buy, software or different hardware for the show to improve the audio quality and make it easier for me to have more guests on the show. I am looking to have more guests on the show, so any recommendations, I really appreciate it. The best place to do that would be by joining the private Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus. And I'll let you in. You can always recommend any show you want there, or you could just message or email me, whatever. But yeah, for those of you who could take the time to donate to this show, you will get some bonus content. Sometimes I, doing a little bit extra interview, or I sit down and chat with one of my buddies in the Libertarian Union, which is, of course, a great group of podcasters that you could find at the Facebook page Libertarian Union or at libertarianunion.com, and you can find my show within there. Of course, one of those fellow members is Patrick McFarlane, who's going to be on an upcoming episode of this show to talk about a really important topic. And I think it's going to be a really great show. I'm looking forward to that show a lot. But me and him have put out some bonus content of us chatting about other libertarian kind of topics and stuff. So think about donating to the show. I really appreciate it. And again, thanks everybody so much for tuning in.